Every NBA season, tons of players take that next step in their development. Bench players become quality starters, starters become all-stars or even all-NBA level players, and every now and then we'll get someone new knocking on the door of MVP talks. But what are some of the factors that lead to these breakouts? Are they things we can predict ahead of time, or do they happen at random? And who are some of the guys with the tools to potentially make that leap in this upcoming season? In order to determine what factors lead to a breakout, we first have to define what that actually means. A breakout looks completely different for everyone, depending on the age, role, or simply what caliber of player they are. When Jalen Brunson broke out for the Knicks in 2023, it was primarily the result of seeing a significant increase to his offensive load, which he then took advantage of by increasing his scoring, playmaking, and jump shooting volume while remaining every bit as efficient. But for Dyson Daniels, who won Most Improved Player last year, his leap was about proving that he could be more than just an occasional starter, solidifying himself as a key rotation piece for the Hawks through his all-time great defensive playmaking and secondary skills on offense. Breakouts happen to all types of different players, at any age, in any stage of development, and on any team. So for this video, I did my best to highlight 5 completely different types of guys, from bench players to potential all-stars. And in order to narrow the list down to 5, there were a few key things I was looking for. More than anything, these players have to be given the opportunity to take the next step forward. Going back to Brunson and Daniels, they were both traded to new teams, given new responsibilities, and asked to play bigger roles. And in order to make it work, they sort of had to break out. So whether it's a trade, an injury, or someone who's just going to get more minutes, simply having the opportunity to improve is the biggest thing. Secondly, I'm looking for players who have a superpower in their game or are simply really advanced in one or two areas. I'll stick with those 2 examples to make it easy. In Dallas, you could clearly see that Brunson's on-ball scoring was ridiculously good, to the point where he looked like an MVP candidate in back-to-back playoff games while Luka was injured. And in New Orleans, Dyson was already one of the better defensive guards in the league, using his size, length, and agility to blow up offenses whenever he found consistent minutes. Once we've established a superpower, the third and final thing I'm looking for is how much of a realistic improvement they can make in other areas to supplement that one skill. For Brunson, he built off of his on-ball scoring by adding a volume pull-up 3, figuring out ways to draw more fouls, and becoming one of the better playmakers in the league. And that's turned him into a complete offensive juggernaut, as he basically sleepwalks to 30 points and 7 assists in the playoffs. For Dyson, he built off of his defensive game by getting even more aggressive with his hands to pick up record-setting deflections. Then he proved that he belonged on offense with a slightly more consistent 3, way more aggression putting the ball on the floor and attacking the paint, and some nice connective passing. Both of these guys saw an opportunity, had a superpower, had realistic ways to build around it, and took the leap. So using those 3 categories as a sort of criteria, I was able to come up with a list of 5 candidates for this upcoming season. The first one being none other than Bennedict Mathurin. Mathurin's coming off a 3rd-year campaign where he played a key role for an NBA Finals team, but it's the extent of that role that I really want to focus on. In the regular season, he started in 49 of his 72 games and averaged about 30 minutes per contest. But in the playoffs, he started in none of his 22 games, averaging a little over 17 minutes. At 23 years old, there's never been a better opportunity for Mathurin to solidify his status as a full-time starter, or potentially even a little bit more. With Halliburton out for the season, somebody's gonna have to shoulder the offensive load. And while most are looking at Nembhard, I think Mathurin has a serious opportunity to emerge as a legitimate 20-point-per-game scorer. We talked about superpowers. Well, his, since entering the league, has been his ability to get to the line. He's ranked in at least the 86th percentile in free throw rate in each of the last 3 seasons, but it's specifically this most recent playoff run I want to talk about. If we take a look at the leaders in free throw attempts per 75 possessions, he not only was near the top, he was ahead of some of the best scorers of this generation in Shea, Luka, and Brunson. And that ability to draw fouls was at the forefront of some ridiculous scoring performances, like when he had 19 points in 19 minutes against the Cavs, or 20 points in 12 minutes against the Knicks, or 27 points in 22 minutes against the Thunder. Actually, it sort of got overlooked how impressive his scoring was in those isolated minutes. Over the entire run, he averaged 23 points per 75 on about 63% true shooting. And that right there is the selling point with Mathurin, the constant aggression going at the rim, whether that's in isolation, off the catch, or in transition, and the way he uses his body to create contact gives him a really nice floor as a scorer. The question is how much else is there? He's a career 34% three-point shooter on mid-volume, so if you're wanting him to play off of other playmakers, that's something you'd love to see improve. He's had some flashes of nice mid-range scoring, but hasn't yet developed into a consistent intermediate weapon, and if that's something he can add to his downhill attack, he instantly becomes a much tougher cover. With that said though, the drawback people always seem to reference on offense is his feel for the game. Sure, he generates a ton of pressure, but rarely ever does he leverage that pressure into opportunities for the guys around him. Not only is he a limited passer, he's rarely ever looking for the pass to begin with, and I think that right there is pretty easily the biggest swing skill in his game. If he develops into even just a solid playmaker, one of two things instantly happens. Let's assume everything else stays the same. Now you have a secondary or tertiary creator who can play off the catch and destroy closeouts, where he's not only a threat to get to the rim or the line, but a threat to find the open man and create quality shots. Now let's assume he takes that leap into a consistent mid-range scorer in addition to the playmaking. This is a player who you can legitimately run offense through in isolation and rely on to create advantages against tight playoff defense. With that said though, if nothing changes, he remains somewhat of a specialist. He can start or come off the bench, provide a nice scoring punch, occasionally erupt for 20, but never be relied on as a focal point of the offense. And with Halliburton out, entering year 4, the opportunity to take these next steps is staring him right in the face. For my second player, I want to shift gears a bit and talk about somebody who should be competing for an all-star team. This one's more health related and might sound obvious, but I'd feel wrong if I didn't talk about Jalen Johnson. His true breakout happened in year 3, when he made the jump from about 6 points a game coming off the bench to 16 points a game as a full-time starter, and he was about to run away with the Most Improved Player award before he went down with injury. Then the exact same script was written for him again in year 4. With averages of 19 points, 10 rebounds, and 5 assists a game, he not only expanded his offense, he took a serious step forward on defense, turning himself into basically the ideal do-it-all athletic forward at just age 23. Once again, he was a betting favorite for Most Improved Player, only to go down with a season-ending injury, leaving us all wondering just how good he'd actually be with a full season of play. His superpower is his rare combination of size and athleticism that just pops off the screen anytime you tune into a Hawks game. He's a big, lengthy forward who can run the floor and jump out of the gym without sacrificing power. He pairs those physical tools with strong touch around the basket, which has turned him into one of the game's better interior scorers. Last season, he made over 72% of his shots at the rim, and these are shots he can get to in a ton of different ways. He can be used as a screener, where he'll get above the rim as a lob threat or create out of the short roll. He can play out of the dunker spot, where he'll space the floor vertically, and he's a good enough ball handler to even create these shots for himself at times, especially in transition. Actually, the big question mark with him moving forward, in my opinion, is just how much juice there is as a half-court creator. Because everything else is already sort of there. Between the screen and roll game, the vertical spacing, and the transition shot creation, it feels like his floor on offense is a souped up version of what Denver's gotten from Aaron Gordon. And the extent of his off-ball value at this point is pretty much reliant on where he ends up as a three-point shooter. Over the last 2 seasons, he's attempted almost 300 catch and shoot threes and made about 35% of them. If he can just sustain that on increased volume, or even get it up to 36 or 37%, we're flat out talking about one of the best off-ball players in the NBA. Like I said though, a leap from Jalen Johnson would result in him getting to an all-star or even all-NBA level over the course of an entire season, and to reach those heights, he'll have to expand his game as a half-court creator. The downhill creation has nice utility, and he's already a really good passer, so you'll occasionally see him operate off of high ball screens or in early isolation. But a large chunk of his shot creation is done in transition against an unset defense. The handle is good enough to carry some responsibility, but not quite good enough to create automatic advantages in the half court. So while he's a lethal finisher at the rim, without an advantage to play off of or ahead of steam, he's not generating those shots at volume. For that reason, I think the biggest swing skill for him is a tighter handle that allows him to more comfortably operate in the half court. But a more realistic pathway to him mitigating some of these issues is adding a mid-range game. As of right now, his mid-range scoring is pretty exclusive to the occasional floater, and if he can find ways to leverage his size into a few more short jumpers, that would probably be enough to push him over the hump. Because, as I mentioned, the floor is a ridiculously talented off-ball scorer who, by the way, offers a ton of defensive versatility. But if he can build off of that by becoming a consistently reliable half-court creator, now he's just an elite number 2, someone who can run offense with bench units, and at the very least, an all-star caliber player. Alright, enough talk about hyper-athletic downhill creators. Now we're going to shift gears to a completely different archetype, and that's Kyle Filipowski from the Jazz. Filipowski's entering year 2, and it feels a bit cheap to call a sophomore a breakout candidate, but with the way he dominated Summer League and the flashes he's shown, I wouldn't feel right leaving him out of this discussion. Obviously, Summer League numbers need to be taken with a grain of salt. What he was doing though is exactly what you want to see from your year 2 player, and that's someone who's performing at a completely different level to the point where it feels like he doesn't belong. After a 3-game stretch of 32, 21, and 35 points, the Jazz shut him down, having seen everything they needed to see. And that's really an extension of an impressive rookie campaign that sort of flew under the radar. The selling point with Filipowski is the offensive versatility he offers at his size. He's a 6'11", 250-pound true center who can pretty much do everything on offense. As a rookie, he attempted 5 threes every 75 possessions and made 35% of them, so we're talking about someone with serious potential as a floor spacer. But that's not all he can do in space. He's also a good enough ball handler to put it on the deck when needed, so he can spot up an attack or beat closeouts. He's a decent passer who sees the floor well, so you can put the ball in his hands and run some offense through him at the top of the key. And speaking of running offense through him, he's got a really nice post game to go along with the skill on the perimeter, which again speaks to that versatility. The big thing though is that he's also a master of the little things. He's a great screener, and between his ability to pop out for the 3, operate in the short roll, attack switches, or get to a hyper efficient push shot, this could become a huge part of Utah's offense moving forward. He's also a good offensive rebounder and does a great job of positioning himself away from the ball to always be a threat. In my opinion, the swing skills on offense have to do with his passing. Like I said, he's a pretty good passer, but he's far from being someone who you can rely on as a legitimate offensive focal point. And if he takes that next step forward as a passer, not only do you get creation from the perimeter, now you get someone who you can run your offense through in the post. With that said though, I don't really have any concerns for his offense moving forward. Between the little things, the outside shooting, the ball handling, touch, and ability to attack mismatches, I feel confident almost guaranteeing that he'll be a great offensive big in the league. The real problems with Filipowski lie on defense. He's one of a few bigs who actually has a negative wingspan and he's incredibly floor-bound, so when those two things come together, you're left with a near 7-footer who offers very little resistance at the rim. His shot blocking numbers as a rookie were almost laughably low, averaging half a block every 75 possessions, and players shot about 4% above their typical field goal percentage when he was contesting them within 6 feet of the basket. In addition to the lack of presence, he fouls a lot, so you could probably make an argument that he was the worst interior defensive big in the league. Typically, weaker interior defenders can make up that ground in other areas, such as by being really switchable, but he also lacks the mobility to really match up with anyone but 4s and 5s. I know it sounds bad. I want to remind you though that the winner of 3 of the last 5 MVPs still suffers from most of these issues. Jokic isn't a vertical presence at the rim. He can't switch onto guards or wings, yet he still found a way to make a difference defensively in a few key areas. For one, he's really good at positioning himself near the level of screens, either in a hedge or a high drop. He consistently closes off driving lanes while using his size and quick hands to take away potential passes. And we've seen some of these flashes from Filipowski. He's shown to be capable of playing those more aggressive screen and roll coverages, and he's got good enough hands to close off passing lanes, pick up deflections, and sometimes even steals. So the pathway to him becoming a passable defender, in my opinion, should be really similar to what we saw from Jokic. And if that's the case, Utah might be the best possible spot to make these improvements because they've got the size and athleticism to always have a vertical presence behind him. He could slightly improve the interior defense with better positioning, and he's already a great defensive rebounder, so he's got that going for him, but I think the two swing skills are pretty obviously the ability to execute aggressive defensive coverages and the ability to make plays on the ball defensively. If he can become even passable defensively while continuing to expand on an already versatile offensive game, he'll be a very good center for a very long time. And you could also describe this next guy in a really similar way, because we're keeping it in Utah with his teammate Brice Sensabaugh. Like Kyle, Brice is 21 years old, only he's entering year 3. and up to this point, he's yet to play in a competitive situation. He started 15 games for them last year, played about 20 minutes a game, and got a chance to showcase his offensive arsenal in short spurts. But after getting rid of both Sexton and Clarkson this offseason, he's a guy who should be competing for a spot as a full-time starter. In his sophomore campaign, a few things popped off the screen, most notably his outside shooting. We're talking about a guy who attempted over 9 threes every 75 possessions, which is just absurd volume, and he made over 42% of them. He was the only player in the league to reach both of those marks, just to provide some context on what caliber of shooter we're talking about. What's so special though is that he isn't one-dimensional. He's a good enough ball handler to play off the catch and beat closeouts, where he's already got a pretty advanced in-between game between high-level mid-range shot making and a reliable floater. And that combination of in-between scoring and high-level three-point shooting fueled a really impressive sophomore scoring season. He averaged over 19 points per 75 on 61% true shooting, which is pretty close to what Michael Porter Jr. put up in this past season. The question with Brice though has always been, what else is there in addition to the shot making? If the floor is a dynamic off-ball shooter, what's the ceiling? One problem of his right now is that he basically never gets to the rim or the line, which is interesting because of his build. He's a sturdy 6'6" wing with a really strong lower body, and if he can find a way to leverage that strength into more of those downhill scoring opportunities, it's pretty easy to see a pathway to a consistent 20 point per game type of guy. But even if he never develops that part of his game, just improving as a passer could go a long way. I'd say he's alright in this regard, and you'd want him to be good, because with the off-ball attention he demands as a shooter, and the way he can work inside the arc with a floater and mid-range game, if he could leverage that threat into more opportunities for teammates as a connector or second-side attacker, now we're talking about some serious offensive value. With all of that said though, the reason I compared him to Filipowski is because the defensive limitations are overwhelming. I'd actually say he's already a good offensive player who could play serious rotation minutes for a playoff team if he were capable of staying on the floor defensively. But as things currently stand, he doesn't have a single redeeming quality. He isn't quick enough to defend guards, and he doesn't offer much resistance against forwards. So his role for the Jazz last season was to basically always guard the worst offensive player and hope he didn't get attacked. Then in these spots, he offered basically no resistance and help, didn't rebound, and rarely made a play on the ball. I don't think there's any pathway to him becoming a strong positive defender. He's simply too weak in too many areas. But like I said, all he has to do is become passable enough to stay on the court for his offense to bring serious value. And most weak defensive players find a way to do that through defensive playmaking. Brice has the size and length, and I'd love to see him get more aggressive looking to make plays on the ball, whether that's swiping at a live dribble, jumping lanes, or even trying to deny touches. If he can add a few deflections to a strong team defense, he should be able to play 30 minutes a game for a legitimate playoff contender. And if he can add more layups and free throws to an already impressive scoring profile, I don't think it's far-fetched to believe there's an all-star caliber offensive player somewhere in there. Now that's a pretty big difference from the guy I've got in my 5th and final spot. For that, we're taking it to Milwaukee with Ryan Rollins. Rollins spent the majority of his first 3 years in the NBA just fighting for a spot in the league. He spent some time with the Warriors, then with the Wizards, and it wasn't until the middle of last season that he found a consistent role with the Bucks. Now that Dame's out of the picture, this team desperately lacks depth in the backcourt or even a surefire starting point guard, and I think there's a serious opportunity for Rollins to be that guy for them. With him, it all starts on defense. He's only 6'3", but he's an extremely impressive athlete with a freak-like 6'10" wingspan, which gives him range as a defensive guard that you won't really find around the league. He's most useful at the point of attack, with the agility and screen navigation to hound opposing guards with constant pressure. But he's also great at chasing shooters around away from the ball, has amazing hands that allow him to consistently make plays in passing lanes, and he's one of a few guards in the league who can offer a legitimate vertical presence at the rim. Due to his lack of size, he isn't very switchable, so you won't get the same sort of resistance against wings or forwards. Strictly as a defensive guard though, I think there's serious all-defensive potential, and the next step for him is simply getting more active and smarter with his positioning as a help defender, which should come with more NBA reps. However, it's the offensive limitations that have prevented him from being a starter in the league. For the Bucks last year, his role was primarily to spot up and shoot, and moving forward, I'd say the biggest key for him is proving that he's a reliable three-point shooter. Over his entire career, regular season and playoffs combined, he's only attempted 140 total threes, and that just simply isn't a big enough sample size to draw any conclusions. So I think this upcoming season could be a huge one, not just for Rollins to continue growing his game, but for his overall perception around the league. Up to this point, he's been a near 41% three-point shooter, and if that's real, he instantly becomes one of the most sought-after supporting guards in the league. Even if he averages out as a 36 or 37% guy though, that would be good enough for him to at least have a consistent spot on the court, as long as he's willing to take the shot with volume. Because for now, I'd say one of the few things holding him back on offense is that he doesn't have a quick enough trigger, especially playing on a team with Giannis. If he's a reliable spot-up shooter with a quick trigger, that forces the defense to react, which then opens up the rest of his game. I talked about his athleticism. Well, that also pops on offense with the way he attacks off the catch or in transition. He's someone who can get all the way to the rim pretty consistently, and he's a quality passer who rarely ever makes mistakes, which is exactly what you want from a complimentary playmaker. Much like I've talked about with some of the other guys, the next step for him might be the in-between scoring, because if he adds a mid-range pull-up or a floater to his driving game, not only does he become an incredibly dynamic off-the-catch weapon, the Bucks could maybe even run some of their offense through him. I don't see him developing into a volume half-court shot creator, but the occasional pick and roll or handoff to get him downhill could be a real option. Of course, this all relies on the three-point shot being real. That's the foundation. Just being a threat to hit that shot opens up the slashing, the connective passing, and the potential to improve in these other areas. And if he develops into a legitimate offensive threat, along with everything he's already capable of doing on defense, that's a guard who every contender would be trying to get. So just to recap, my criteria for selecting potential breakout candidates came down to 3 key areas. The first is whether or not they have the opportunity to improve. The second is whether or not they have a standout skill, and the third is whether or not they have a realistic pathway to building around that skill. In my opinion, Bennedict Mathurin, Jalen Johnson, Kyle Filipowski, Brice Sensabaugh, and Ryan Rollins are 5 players who fit this criteria to a T. But my actual list was about 25 players long, so if you want a part 2, or maybe even want me to turn this into a series, let me know down in the comments. For now though, I'll leave you with these 5. We've got potential all-stars, guys fighting to make the starting lineup, dynamic scorers, athletic defenders, and all that's to say, a breakout truly looks different for every player. These are just 5 of the many who have a chance to take that next step in this upcoming NBA season.